George Stephanopoulos rose to prominence as a senior advisor to President Bill Clinton. And for the past 20 years, he's been co-anchor of Good Morning America, as well as co-host of This Week on ABC. His new book, The Situation Room, recounts the highest pressure decisions made by U.S. presidents during the most dramatic moments in modern history. We'll be discussing his book, his career, in and out of politics, and more in this Newsday Live Long Island LitFest conversation from Newsday Studios. Please welcome George Stephanopoulos.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Hello, everyone.
So they let you out on a school night.
Yeah, barely, you know. We'll both be up very early.
I know, we're both morning anchors. I mean, you're notable, of course. I'm still working to get to your level, of course. How are you feeling this? How was the Long Island traffic? I know it was tough.
Well, I'm kind of used to it, but
Okay.
today was especially bad. It took me, I got into the car at 4:45, and I got here at 6:50.
Oh, record time.
That's record time?
Yeah.
I don't know. 25 miles.
Yeah, I commute from Staten Island here every morning.
Oh, man.
So there you go. Oh, look at everyone. Oh. If you all have any listings on Long Island, please let me know. I'm looking for a home. Well, let's get right into it.
Yeah.
Of course, I want to say congratulations. You're now a New York Times bestseller. I mean, this is incredible.
Yeah, we just found out it's #1. Thank you. It was a nice surprise.
I know, breaking news, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, let's get right into it. George, you give us a front row seat inside the Situation Room, described in your book as a place, a set of people, and process, handling some of the most contentious moments in American history. I gotta ask you this. How did you get more than 100 people to talk to you about their experiences in such a secretive environment?
It was not easy at first, but it was, we started the book about two and a half years ago, and I knew as soon as I heard the idea about the Situation Room, the only question I had was, has it been done before? And when I heard the answer to that was no, there had been one book by a staffer about 20-something years ago that was a little more technical. I knew it would be a great vehicle to tell a story about the history of the United States over the last 60 years, the history of the presidency over the last 60 years, and to introduce the public to these duty officers who staff the White House Situation Room 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that turned out to be the nice surprise of the book. We didn't know we would be able to get so many of them to do interviews, but we found a Facebook page of alumni of the Situation Room. And we contacted the director of the Facebook page and the head of the Alumni Association. And it's one of those things, when one talked, then another talked, then another talked, and they made the book come alive. I mean, that's really what makes this book different, I think, from a lot of other history books. We tell it from the perspective of these people who are anonymous, apolitical, serving their country under the highest pressure circumstances in the most competent way with incredible character. And for me, that was what was most inspiring about doing the book, getting the chance to talk to these people and share their stories.
I believe it was Michael Stiegler who said they serve the country in silence.
In silence. And Michael Stiegler, what a man he is. I actually opened the book with Michael Stiegler because he was the White House duty officer on January 6th. And he describes driving in around 4 a.m. that day and knowing something was off, knowing something was not right that day, and he was actually on the phone with the Secret Service and other officials on Capitol Hill when the line was breached, when the rioters got through. He was on the phone with the Secret Service detail of Vice President Mike Pence. And one of the things he said to me, he said the most horrible part of that day was that he said people do not understand how close we came to losing the vice president. And so he's sitting there in the Situation Room trying to figure out where the vice president is. Because they had lost contact with the vice president, they knew he was in danger, they started to implement something called the continuity of government procedures. It sounds so bland and bureaucratic. What those procedures are what were instituted by Dwight Eisenhower at the height of the Cold War to make sure the government survived a nuclear attack. And when this riot broke out, they had to implement those procedures for only the second time in American history. The only other time was on 9/11. And while they're in contact with Capitol Hill, while they're implementing these procedures to set up a whole alternate government in case it falls, the President of the United States is sitting up in his study off the Oval Office, sipping Diet Cokes, and sending out tweets attacking Mike Pence. Mike Stiegler and his colleagues who served on that day were kind of in shock. And he told me he worried, and several of his colleagues worried, that the institutions, the entire institutions of the United States would crumble that day, because this had never happened before. We had never had an insurrection inspired by the President of the United States. But he finished serving that day, the certification happened. He went home and he couldn't speak, he couldn't tell his wife about it. Went right back to work the next day, served in silence, again the next day. And to this day, he and his fellow officers who served on that day, they actually go to the Lincoln Memorial every January 6th and raise a glass to the fact that the Republic did stand on that day. These people are incredible patriots.
So why did you start with January 6th? I feel like you just told us, but why?
Because it's an unprecedented, it's never happened before in American history. Never in American history have we had a President of the United States reject the peaceful transfer of power. It's one of the most momentous things that's ever happened. And for the people in the Situation Room, think about the White House Situation Room. These are the people that have dealt with assassinations, the assassination of President Kennedy, the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, the attacks on 9/11, the wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan, natural disasters. And on this day, they were dealing with an insurrection that was actually inspired by the president himself. And the whole job of the White House Situation Room is to deal with these crises and to make sure the president has all the information he needs during these crises. He did not call down once, not once, to the Situation Room.
Wow. So speaking of Trump, since we're...
I don't think I said his name, but go ahead.
Just for a moment, you're being sued for defamation by the former president following an interview you did with South Carolina Republican Nancy Mace. Can you talk about that?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Nancy Mace was a Republican congresswoman from South Carolina. Her career actually took off when she was in the State House in South Carolina, and she took the floor and described her experience as a survivor of rape. And now, she used to be quite critical of Donald Trump. She used to say what happened on January 6th was horrendous. She's completely flipped, now is one of his strongest supporters. And I asked her a simple question. How can you, as a survivor of rape, support a man who's been found liable for rape by a jury? And she got very upset. He got very upset. He's trying to argue technically that I shouldn't have used the word rape because under New York law, the law says sexual abuse. The problem with his argument is that the judge in the case said that it's rape. He said sexual abuse is rape. And I don't want to get too graphic here, but he's the one who sued me, so I can explain it. We've already filed a motion to dismiss. I'm very confident that it'll either be dismissed or it'll go away, because I really don't think he wants to pursue this the whole way, because it would require a deposition where he would have to argue that what he did was not rape. And again, I'm not going to get into the graphic details, but if you read the motion to dismiss, you'll realize that he cannot answer the questions that we would file in that motion.
Well, let's go back to the book, because we're going to talk more about the former president. But according to your research, even President Kennedy, who helped come up with the idea of the Situation Room, was not a fan. He called it a pig pen.
It's so true. The Situation Room was created by John F. Kennedy back in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs disaster. That was that failed invasion of Cuba. He was very angry. He was very angry at the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff for giving what he considered bad intelligence and bad information. So he was determined, he wanted to have an independent flow of information coming into the White House because he believed that information was power. It's interesting, though, he actually had received a memo 2 weeks before the Bay of Pigs from his military aide, which we believe was the first time the term Situation Room was mentioned, but he didn't act on it until after the Bay of Pigs. But the person who gave him the memo is a story in and of himself. A gentleman named Godfrey McHugh. He was an Air Force general. He actually spoke English with a French accent because he was raised in Paris by an American industrialist. And he's one of these people that throughout his life was just at every momentous event possible for a young man. He actually dined as a teenager at the White House with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. He sailed on Harry Truman's yacht. He dated Jackie Kennedy before John Kennedy married her. And Kennedy was so close to him, they became close friends, was so close to him that he was called his military aide, but he was really the aide for everything personal that John F. Kennedy needed. He would escort the Emperor of Ethiopia on a mission for Kennedy. He took a plane load of people to Moscow for Kennedy. He actually, and this is heartbreaking, in the days after John F. Kennedy died, well, on the day he was shot, Jackie asked him to stay back with the casket on the plane when she had to go up for the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson. He said he would never leave his side. And the next day, it was John's third birthday. And Jackie couldn't celebrate the birthday that day. So Godfrey McHugh threw the little birthday party for John. He was just a close member of the family, and we believe he's the first person to ever advance the term Situation Room to a president. But you're right. Once they had it all set up, they did it in 2 weeks, $30,000. Kennedy hardly ever went there. He didn't like it. He thought it was a pig pen. He did use it, the information, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but did not go down there a lot.
But you yourself, you said it was underwhelming.
For the longest time it was. The first question I would ask everybody in the interviews, and we did over 100 interviews, was, do you remember your first time in the Situation Room? I actually didn't remember my first time in the Situation Room. I write that I like to think I had a good excuse because I don't know how many of you remember the first few days of the Clinton administration. They were pretty chaotic. And I was the press secretary at the time, and I was dealing with about 3 different crises at the same time, it was clear that the president's attorney general nominee, Zoe Baird, was going to be let go, but I had to do briefings where I couldn't say that. We were already had the controversy of gays in the military. We had a controversy over the White House briefing room. So I was dealing with all that. I think I probably went there in the first couple of days, but I don't remember the exact moment. And in those days, it was a pretty unremarkable room. It was, a conference room, windowless, kind of looked like a conference room in the Poconos. Not high tech in any real way. Now, I had the chance to go back last August, just before I was finishing the book, and just before they revealed the new White House Situation Room. And as I walked in, my first thought was, wow, it finally looks like it does in the movies. It is completely high tech right now. Screens everywhere, stadium seating for the watch officers they all have 3 computer screens in front of them, plus all the screens on the wall. The president's conference room has the capability to have literally international summits. And he's done it several times, including right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He had 8 foreign leaders all in a meeting simultaneously in that room. It's incredible now.
Well, I want to touch on your personal experience in the Situation Room under President Clinton. How was that? I mean, I definitely want to bring up one other thing, but just generally, how was that going into some of those meetings?
I mean, it was an incredible experience. I mean, when you're in the Situation Room, you're dealing with the most consequential issues. And by the time they get to the president, they're the most difficult issues that any president has to face. I had a lot of interaction daily just talking to the Situation Room duty officers on the phone because of the nature of my responsibilities as press secretary and communications director. Like, I would call them first thing in the morning before I briefed the president, before I briefed network reporters on doing their stand-ups on the White House lawn. So I would get up-to-date information, and then all throughout the day. And then we often had meetings there, some to prepare for presidential meetings, but also ones with the president on some of the big issues as well, including Bosnia, the fallout from the Oklahoma City bombing, the downing of TWA Flight
And let's
800.
talk about TWA, the crash that exploded off the South Shore of Long Island. Describe what it was like in that meeting, and what was your job in that moment?
my job in that moment, we were actually in the back office off the Situation Room because we had some video capability at the time. And I don't know if you remember from those days, the big issue then was trying to combat conspiracy theories about what happened. And there were so many different conspiracy theories at the time, including that maybe it was friendly fire by an actual U.S. missile that took it down. Could it have been an enemy missile? And so that was really what we were deliberating through in most of those early meetings.
So let's talk about a moment where the nation changed forever, 9/11. What did you learn about how the Situation Room was used? I understand it was remote because the president, George W. Bush, was in the classroom at the time.
Well, it was an amazing day. The director of the Situation Room was with the president in Florida. But the Situation Room was up and running in the White House because they were getting information to the president out there. And you know, when the first plane went in, they actually were not that alarmed. I mean, it was bad, but they said planes do go into buildings. It was that moment when the second plane went in, and I talked to a duty officer named Rob Hargis, who was the point person talking to the sit room director, Deb Lower, who was with the president. They were on the phone as the second plane went in. And Rob Hargis tells the story. He actually thought it was a replay of the first plane going in. And then he saw live on the bottom of the screen. And as soon as he saw that live, he said, "Hold on, Deb, America is under attack," which became the famous line because Deb Lower said it to Andy Card, who whispered it into the president's ear in Sarasota. But the story of that day inside the Situation Room is a story of valor and courage. You had Situation Room duty officers who were across the Washington region all flood in to the Situation Room, just like the firefighters went down to the World Trade Center. They wanted to be there, even though the White House at that moment was a target. And remember, after the first two planes went into the World Trade Center, there were still many other planes flying. And everybody in the White House believed, and the Secret Service believed, that the White House was the number one target. So those duty officers in the Situation Room were ordered to evacuate, ordered to get out.
And they didn't.
They were asked 3 times to leave. Every single time they said no. And finally, the director said, "I know you're not going to leave now." So he handed out a 3x5 card to each person. So they all wrote their name and social security number on a card, which were taken out of the Situation Room. It was the kill list. So they would have a record if indeed the White House was hit on that day. But they were not going to leave their posts. As one of the officers, Ed Padinsky, who's a naval officer, told me, this is where we fight from.
And let's talk about that fight. In May of 2011, President Obama and his team watched from the Situation Room as Navy SEALs carried out the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Talk about that. Let's walk through it.
Well, that was a years-long process to reach that decision, done in the highest secrecy, and it never leaked. I mean, that, which is kind of amazing. And for me, looking at that, I come away thinking, as I look back at the presidents, that probably the 2 best presidents at handling the whole Situation Room national security process were President George H.W. Bush and his team with Brent Scowcroft, and the way that they dealt with the sweep of revolutions across Eastern Europe and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the way they managed that crisis and the way they managed the first Gulf War, and the way that President Obama and his team managed the takedown of Osama bin Laden. One of the most impressive things about it was the way they learned the lessons of the failed mission of Jimmy Carter and made sure that, you know, they had enough helicopters, they had the right communications. The leader of the team, Admiral McRaven from the Navy SEALs, had studied the failed mission for a generation. But even with all the preparation they had, when they were reaching the final decision, which was the Thursday before the Sunday, and there was a meeting in the Situation Room, it was still as close a call as you can possibly imagine. The best intelligence they had was that it was somewhere between a 40 and a 60% chance that this person, this pacer, who they had identified in the Abbottabad compound, was actually Osama bin Laden. And President Obama finally said, listen, at best it's 50-50. It's not going to get any better than that. We just have to make a call. And he polled everyone in the room. Eventually, they all agreed that this was the right thing, even though Bob Gates, who had been a veteran of the failed Iran mission, was more reluctant than everybody else. But the president polled everyone in the room, polled all the plus ones in the room, made the decision. And I don't know if you remember, but that was the weekend of the White House Correspondents' Dinner when President Obama eviscerated Donald Trump in his speech. He actually had, the joke writers obviously didn't know anything about what was going on, and he had a session with his joke writers that afternoon in the Oval Office, and they had a joke about Osama bin Laden, and he just had to kind of say, it's not that funny, and take it out. But I was actually at the Correspondents' Dinner that night, and at the table with the White House Chief of Staff, Bill Daley, and the National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, and my wife was sitting between the two of them. And my wife is really fun, really funny, pretty, great dinner companion.
She's kind of funny.
Yeah, she is funny.
She's really funny.
She's very funny. They weren't giving her the time of day, and she was saying Bill Daley would not look up from his phone, and she was giving him a hard time about it. And then Eric Stonestreet from Modern Family was across the table, and he was sitting there complaining about his White House tour the next day being canceled, and Daley saying something about, the plumbing's all messed up in the White House. It all went off the next day without a hitch, and we all saw them in that now iconic photo that was actually taken in a room just off the Situation Room. And the person we owe for that photo is one of the most remarkable characters in the book, a guy named Gary Bresnahan, who is just a tech wizard. Huh?
I was finishing your statement because I'm so excited about the book. Go ahead.
Well, I call him the combination of MacGyver and Zelig
that's what
in the
is,
Situation Room, because he is the MacGyver. He's the guy that jerry rigs all of the technology all the time. And he's Zelig because he, not only Godfrey McHugh 50 years earlier, was just in every important event of the last 7 presidents. He was in the hospital with Ronald Reagan when he was shot. He was in the Situation Room on 9/11. He was on the plane with Robert McFarlane when he had that mission for the Iran hostage Contra deal, carrying cakes and Bibles to the Iranians. Gary was there. He was on the secret mission to Tiananmen Square with Brent Scowcroft after the massacre because he was setting up the communications between Brent and the president. He was the videographer for President Clinton's grand jury testimony in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, because he was the one who had set up the secret line so that it wouldn't leak. So they said, you're going to have to be the videographer even though that's not your job. And he tells the story about how he was there for the practice sessions with Clinton and all his lawyers, and they took a break, and Clinton looks over and said, how am I doing? Gary goes, I have no idea how you're doing. I'm just the videographer, But on that day, he had set up the feed for the team to see what was happening in Abbottabad. And originally, it wasn't in the main room, because it was just supposed to be for the military guys talking to McRaven. But the minute everybody else in the big room heard about it, they started to float over into the other room, including the president. So that Tom Donilon asked Gary Bresnahan, can we move the feed into the actual Situation Room? And it was one of the few times he said he ever lied to the National Security Advisor. He said it was a white lie. He said he told him he couldn't do it. Now, he confessed that he probably could have done it, but he was very worried that if he moved it anything at all, the line would go down. We all know what technology is like, and he wasn't going to take the risk. And it's a good thing, because they didn't move, we had that iconic photo. It was also a great thing for Gary Bresnahan, because he was just outside the room working on it all, so that after the takedown, he was the first person to get a fist bump from President Obama when he walked out of the room, and that made his day.
Well, you know what, George, you mentioned the transcripts from the sit room. They're very, very rare. Only a few tapes exist. The day Kennedy was assassinated, just 2 years after he created the sit room himself. What could you hear on those tapes?
Heartbreaking to this day. What they're tapes of are the sit room duty officer calling Pierre Salinger, who was the president's press secretary, who was actually on a plane to Tokyo with several cabinet officials. And you hear the crackling line and the voice of the duty officer, which is just like every pilot you've ever had, even if going through the worst turbulence, he's flatlining, and he's just saying, we have word that the president has been shot. That's all, though. Over. 5 minutes later, we heard it's serious. He's shot in the head. Connolly is injured as well. Over. And then a few minutes later, the word that the president had died, and you even hear Walter Cronkite in the background. I should add here, one of the great things for those of you who like audiobooks, and this audiobook was so much fun to do because it's really more like a podcast. We include, you can hear the tapes when in the audiobook. We have other tapes as well, Lyndon Johnson's tapes into the Situation Room, calling through the night on Vietnam. We include broadcast, and I did every interview on Zoom, so that when you're going through, I do the narration, but when I'm quoting someone I interviewed, you actually hear their voice. It's like a conversation. So it's a rich experience.
You're literally on the edge of your seat listening to the tapes, because I read the book and I listened to the audio version. Incredible piece of work. And let's stick to LBJ, because you mentioned him. He then inherited the Situation Room after the assassination, and he was heavily focused on the Vietnam War. And in your book, you wrote, tapes revealed an uncertain man, angry, often depressed. Like, if you're in the Situation Room as a staff member, how do you deal with a president that is under this condition?
It's just not easy. Kennedy didn't like the Situation Room. Johnson loved it. Johnson actually moved his favorite chair down from the Oval Office into the Situation Room. He was there all the time. Had he served 8 years, he would have spent more time in the Situation Room than any other president. But even more than that, he was on the phone with the duty officers all through the night, all through 1965, looking for any scrap of information about Vietnam, body counts, casualties, whatever happened in a battle. And he's desperate for this information, and these duty officers, sometimes they didn't have any very good information, and it's hard to convey that to the president. But the real problem for Johnson was he was so desperate. He did feel trapped. All that information that he was seeking from the duty officers couldn't really help him solve this problem. It was an unwinnable war, and deep down he knew it, but he was trapped by it, and he couldn't figure out how to get out. So this is one of those situations where this information is just not giving him any insight, not the insight that he needs to solve this problem. And it's kind of the tragedy, it is the tragedy of his presidency, because in that year where we hear him on these tapes so desperate about Vietnam, he passed, it was probably the most successful year of a president ever in passing domestic legislation. He was a master of that, but he could not figure out Vietnam.
Another rare recording, the chaos after Ronald Reagan was shot. There was a heated exchange, and in which you called the most dramatic and chaotic day in the history of the sit room. The question was, who's running the government at this time?
Remember Al Haig? Al Haig had that famous moment where he was Secretary of State, but he went up to the podium and said, I'm in charge. He thought he was second in line for the presidency. What you learn from these tapes, this is very rare. This was the only time that a tape recorder, there were tape recorders have been brought in a Situation Room twice, as far as we could tell. This was the more consequential one. The other one was Omarosa actually snuck one in her pen to catalog when she was fired during the Trump administration. But on this day, Richard Allen, the president's national security advisor, brought a tape recorder in to capture the deliberations of himself, the White House chief of staff, the Secretary of Defense, as they were dealing with, and the Secretary of State, as they were dealing with the president being shot. And at the hospital, Vice President Bush was flying in from Dallas. He wasn't there at the time, and one of the questions was, who's running things right now? Where's the nuclear football? Is the president conscious? Does he have to give up his powers under the 25th Amendment? And actually, in that meeting, and you have it on the tape, Al Haig says the same thing he was going to say upstairs, but it was so dumb that nobody even bothered to correct him. They just said, that we have too much else to deal with. But they didn't know he was going to go up to the briefing room and declare it to the world. Somebody should have warned him. It would have saved him, a mark of infamy on his career.
So there are a lot of fascinating, almost, I would call it oddity moments in the book. In your book, you mentioned Jimmy Carter's attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran, and he consulted with psychics?
This was the most interesting reporting story in the book. As we were preparing, the way my team and I did it, I had a great team, a co-writer, Lisa Dickey, and two terrific researchers, Cameron Peters and Emily Michelle. And we went at it this pretty methodically. First, we knew we would have a chapter on each president, and then we had to identify which crisis we would focus on with each president before we did the interviews. And as I was preparing to do the Carter chapter, I was going through his diary, and I saw one line from his diary from May 8th, 1980, where he said, had a meeting in the Situation Room on parapsychology, longitude, latitude, and et cetera. I saw parapsychology and Situation Room in the same sentence. I said, hey, there might be a story here for our book. And we went down to the presidential library. We scoured all of the written records. Nothing had been written about it. And we tried to find who might have been there. Interestingly, Rosalind Carter was in the meeting, which was the only policy meeting we could ever find of a first lady being in the Situation Room. And we finally found a naval aide to Carter named Jake Stewart, who's about 85 years old now, who those at the Carter Library said he might have been in the meeting. He did not want to talk to me. We sent letters, we sent emails, I tried to call him, but as I persisted, he softened up a little bit, and he finally agreed to get on a Zoom. And then it was just such a fun moment for me, because when he finally got on the Zoom, I pulled out the diary, I read him the entry, and his face just lit up, and he smiled, and he said, oh, so you found out about that. He was finally ready at 85 years old to tell the story of what happened in the Situation Room that day, and it's an incredible story. He was the White House aide who was most read in to something called Operation Grill Flame. Operation Grill Flame was an actual program of the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agencies in the late 1970s and early 1980s, where they spent millions upon millions of dollars investing in psychics. People, literally psychics, people who would go sit alone in dark rooms at Fort Meade. They called them remote viewers, close their eyes, and imagine things that were happening around the world. They said that they had fairly good success in imagining. They'd identified a plane crash in Africa. One remote viewer tells the story of how on the day the helicopters went down in the desert, she was doing her viewings and saw some kind of a catastrophe, saw explosions, and then broke down in tears because it was so horrifying. That was the day the helicopters went down, which sets the scene for this meeting, because this meeting on May 8th, 1980 was 2 weeks after the failed mission in the desert. And Carter is just desperate. He is desperate for any piece of information that might help him find a way out of this hostage crisis, which has just crippled his presidency, going to cause him to lose to Ronald Reagan. It turned out that both he and Rosalind Carter had were intrigued by the supernatural. Rosalind Carter had several meetings with, remember Uri Geller? The guy who used to bend spoons with his mind. Not only did he do that, I found out about that. We interviewed Uri Geller as well, because he had spent hours with Rosalind Carter and also hours with the president before this meeting. He also made millions of dollars. He was hired by mining companies who also bought into this. He would go into dark rooms and tell them where they could find mineral deposits and oil and things like that. So they were drawn to the supernatural. They wanted this briefing on the psychics. Jake Stewart runs through it all, goes through it for about 45 minutes. Carter does not say a word. Finally, as he's winding up, Carter takes out a notepad, just writes one word on the notepad. You can guess what the word is: hostages. And he said, can you do anything? He was so desperate in that moment. He was calling on psychics to try and help him solve this problem. Stewart did go to work on it. He says that the remote viewers helped identify the location of one of the hostages named Richard Queen, who was suffering from multiple sclerosis. And the Iranians actually did let him out early But of course, all the other hostages were not released until Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. And they were going to stick it to Carter one last time. So he tried everything, but it didn't work.
But there was a trip to, what was it, Connolly? He ended up going out to do a mission. I know there was a discrepancy in which the hostages were being held.
Well, there had been whole investigations on what was called the October surprise.
Yeah.
Did the Reagan team somehow have back channel conversations with the Iranians, trying to convince them to hold the hostages until after the election? So a whole congressional investigation was done, said there was nothing to it, even though there'd been a lot of circumstantial evidence. But last year, a former lieutenant governor of Texas, Ben Barnes, I think is his name, and had talked about going on a mission with John Connolly. Of course, he was in the car with John F. Kennedy when he was shot, but he became a Republican later, and did confirm that there were some conversations going on at the time at some level.
Let's move on. Another interesting moment in the book, Ronald Reagan's speechwriter, Peter Robinson. Let's talk about that one.
Tear down this wall.
Yes.
Most famous lines Ronald Reagan uttered, probably one of the most triumphant moments of his presidency. What this is a story about, though, is how the president and his young speechwriter actually had to buck the collective wisdom of the Situation Room to get this done. He tells the story, Peter Robinson tells the story on himself. The first time he proposed this line to Reagan, he actually proposed it in German. And his boss said, if you're trying to do the signature line of a speech for an American president, you might want to try to write it in English. So he worked on that for a while, and they finally came to tear down this wall. But the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, all the other top diplomats did not want this line in the speech. They thought it was just too provocative. So every time there was a draft of the speech that had this line in it, they took it out. Peter Robinson and Reagan put it back in. Finally, up until the final day that he was giving it, they tried one more time to get it out. But this was one of those instances where the gut instincts of the president were more right for the moment than the collective wisdom of the Situation Room.
Let's talk about, you kind of touched on this a little bit with Bresnahan, Clinton's taped testimony from the MAPS room regarding the Monica Lewinsky scandal. I know there was a huge setup with that and just trying to...
Well, they were so worried it was going to leak.
Yes.
While he was giving the testimony. Of course, it was all published later, but Gary was able to come up with a secure line that it didn't leak from that day. But it was eventually put into the Star Report and released to everybody.
You were working under Clinton
Not
at
then.
At that point?
No, I left in, I worked the first term.
Okay.
I worked from, my last day in the White House was December 31st, 1996. So that whole episode in the second term.
We just had to clarify. Well, let's talk about phone calls, setting up calls for the heads of state. That's
one of the
something you
biggest
don't
jobs
think
in the
of, but
Situation Room.
it is challenging. Walk us through that process. I know one of the staffers said Putin always made Obama wait.
He made everybody wait. One of the big jobs for the duty officers in the Situation Room is setting up these phone calls, and it's a very elaborate effort. You have to have one duty officer in the Oval Office, two more down in the Situation Room. You have to. Usually, they try to get the other foreign leader on the phone first before the president comes on, but Putin and Obama, and he also did with Clinton a little bit as well, always plays a game of chicken. He wants to make the president wait. So finally, one of the duty officers in the Situation Room developed an Obama accent, and would get on the line and say, hello, Vladimir, this is the president. And as soon as then Putin picked up, he would hang up the phone and then give it to the president.
Talk about prank calls too, because you wouldn't think a prank call would get through that channel.
They get most of, they stop most of them, but one of the prank calls that wasn't was Prince Charles. Prince Charles once called, and they just didn't believe it was Prince Charles, and they kept drilling him because usually when calls come in, they're never put through. They take the information and then have the president call back. But this was Prince Charles, he said, And they just did not believe it, but he finally proved to them that he was, and he got through.
Oh, wow. Well, you know what? We have a live audience here, and they have tons of questions for
Great.
you. Let's see. Steve has the microphone. Who do we have now? Who would like to ask a question? There we go. We have a couple here.
George, I've been a fan for years.
Thank you.
I've watched you from back in the day, and my wife would stand and might show you why. Honey, stand up a little bit. We have things in common, George. She's got me by about 5 or 6 inches. But here's my question.
I'm used to it. It's okay.
I gotcha. I want to take you back 30 years, and this is the question I always wanted to ask you. So it's you, James, and Bill. And I'm only saying Bill now out of just because of the situation. And so the question came up, and you guys came up with the response. Let's just say he didn't inhale. I want to know who came up with that, you, Bill, or James? Or is that not true?
It's not true.
Not true.
I can tell you what happened. No, that was a Sunday morning. It was a local CBS debate. I think Marsha Kramer might have actually asked the question. And James and I were actually in our hotel room watching it. And we couldn't believe he said it. But that was, it was, it was what was exasperating about Clinton. It was what was charming about Clinton. It was what kind of worked. He always would try to figure out a way to be on every side of an issue so that he could, not exclude anyone. And so that was the way he was, yes, I did it, but I didn't inhale. He was trying to have it a little bit of both ways. I kind of thought it might be true, but it was an unfortunate truth. We actually didn't think it was a brilliant line. We thought it was, if it were true, it would have been better had he lied about it and just said, yeah, I smoked. But
Did you like Bill?
yes. I mean, I was, like a lot of people, I was disappointed by what happened in the second term. Because I think it was just, and I wrote about this in my last book, I thought he was a very good president, but that was just, it wasted so much. And you can write alternative histories about what might have happened had that scandal not happened. I personally believe that Al Gore would have won if that hadn't happened, and then we'd have an entirely different history.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Hi, I'm Kristen.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Hi.
You're obviously so passionate about all of these stories. I wonder if when you were writing the book, it brought up maybe you're missing the adrenaline and the excitement of the White House. Did it make you miss being in the action again?
Yes and no. There's nothing like working in the White House. It was a very stressful time, but to have the privilege of going into the White House every day, working with the smartest people you're ever going to work with, having all the information of the world at your fingertips, and even with all the pressures and all the ups and downs, knowing that on any given day, you have the chance to be part of a decision that might change people's lives for a generation, that's a pretty special experience. I feel very lucky that I had it. I don't, I'm not going to go back. I can't go back. I'm in a different stage of my life. But what I did like about doing this book, I don't know about all of you, but covering politics the last several years has not been fun. And my producers at GMA will confirm this. When I get into the office at around 3:30 or 4 in the morning, most days when we're trying to figure out how to cover what's going on, I'm generally a little bit irritated, a little bit angry, often sad about what we have to do. But then I would finish the show, and in the afternoons I would have these interviews with these remarkable, patriotic people who are just dedicated to their country and dedicated to serving their country, and it lifted me up every day. And to have the chance to tell their stories, it was inspiring for me to have that chance. And one of the things I hope for this book is that people who read the book will be inspired in the same way by their example, these people who are unsung heroes. And I think that's important at this time, for people to understand that there are an awful lot of good people who are doing their best in government every single day, even when they're reviled as the deep state. What I learned is they're committed patriots.
George, did you receive any feedback from any of the individuals that you
Oh,
interviewed?
I've gotten a lot, and
since
it's
the
been
book?
great. I mean, one of the nicest ones, Mike Stiegler actually texted me last week, and he thanked me because he had so many of his fellow duty officers thank him, because it was kind of a liberating experience to finally have their story told, and a cathartic experience for a lot of them. And I had the chance, just before the book came out, a couple of weeks ago, it was probably 2 weeks ago tomorrow, I went to the White House and actually spoke to the Alumni Association of the Situation Room before the book came out, and got a tour of the Situation Room, and met with all of them, and heard their stories in person again. And that was a really special experience.
Incredible. This book is really giving them a voice. I mean, you're seeing the people who are working for this country. Any other questions? Don't be bashful. Oh, we have hands. Steve.
In the last 24 hours, I attended a book signing of Fareed Zakaria,
Oh.
and last night Bill Maher. Both of them referred to a sister soldier moment, suggesting that this president have one. Were you there when Bill Clinton had his?
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about, what's the story behind that one?
Sister Soldier was, she was a rap singer at the time, and I don't remember the exact words, but it was something along the line. She had a song that said, "Are we gonna have it?" And forgive me if I'm misquoting it, but it was along these lines of "A day where we all kill white people." And Bill Clinton was speaking at the Jesse Jackson Push conference when he decided to take this on, and it was, sort of going against his base, being willing to speak out against those who were his biggest supporters in the black community. That's the way it was taken, and it was he gave the speech. Jesse Jackson got incredibly angry and wanted Clinton to apologize for it, and we all believed, and Clinton had said it, and he believed as well, that no, he shouldn't apologize for it. What she had said was unacceptable, and it was okay to call it out. And we had a very long, tense day. And then finally, at the end of the day, we were all up in the hotel suite, and he sees the evening news and realized that it looked better than it felt when Jesse Jackson was yelling at him. So he didn't apologize, and we moved on. And it probably did help him in the campaign.
Any other questions?
I was just wondering how you and your colleagues manage your mental health when you're reporting sometimes on such horrible natural disasters or other tragedies like mass shootings.
That's the hardest thing to do. And I've spent many times when, whether it was the Orlando shooting at the Pulse nightclub or the one in Las Vegas where they killed 75 people. Remember that concert? I was on for about 6 hours in a row then. The Newtown shooting, I was there on the scene. The shooting of the congressional baseball game, we did about 6 or 7 hours as well. I mean, all you can do in those moments is try to be clear with your audience, try to give the best information you have, while you're also empathizing with the victims. The hardest thing to do in those moments, and I always, feel abashed by this, but often the parents of some of the victims want to come on even when they're waiting for information. And it's the hardest possible interview to do because they're just in pain, and they just want to let their story out in some way, thinking that in some way it might help. But it's just agonizing to feel their pain. And all you can do is kind of be there as a witness to help bring their story out. And then, with a lot of those stories, I'll report on it all day, be as straight as I can. Sometimes there are times when I've teared up on air in some of those situations, and I got quite emotional on January 6th when I was covering that for several hours as well. And sometimes that's okay, but you try to keep it together as best you can while you're on the air. And then, when you get home, you're a human being, and I've, hug my kids and cry a little bit and get up and go to work the next day. You have to try to be there in the moment, but not let it kind of corrode you, and that's hard. But you don't want to get too callous either, and then that's the difficult balancing act.
Another question?
George, on these duty officers, how are they selected and what kind of training do they get to take on this responsibility?
They come from all over the government. They come from the CIA, the DIA, Homeland Security, State, Defense, all branches of the military. They're generally the best of the best from their departments. A lot of them are intelligence officers. A lot of them are communications specialists, and they're picked by their bosses for this plum position. It's generally 1 to 3 years, and what they say they look for is it has to be people who can handle pressure. It has to be people who are super competent but not arrogant, because you're generally talking to higher level, higher ranking people in the government. You have to have a good eye and ear for what is different in the information flows you're getting, because so much is coming in, and you have to have a real good sense of what is signal and what is noise. What is the real information that has to be passed up the chain, and what is just more noise here, and it's a difficult combination of skills they have to master.
George, if I can interrupt a little bit, you talk about the first duty officer in your book and just the shift time. It was a 24-hour.
Under Kennedy,
Yeah.
he actually did 24-hour shifts. They would work 24-hour shifts and then take 2 days off. Now it's a series of, now they all work 12-hour shifts, either 5 to 5 or 5 to 5 each day, with a little bit of overlap for each of them, which is still a pretty grueling shift. They'll generally work 4 12-hour shifts a week.
I noticed also in the book you mentioned that there was a cot there for them to sleep, but how can you sleep if you have to watch out for this?
Gary Bresnahan was the one who used the cot, because he wasn't the watch officer. He was the guy that had to fix things if anything went wrong, so he often used it.
So he did use the cot. Okay, good to know. Oh, and another question. Do we have one?
I think a lot of people are really fascinated by the inner workings of the White House and politics in general, which is probably why this book is making the top of the bestseller list. But from that, I think a lot of movies and TV shows have really tried to capture what that's like, from The West Wing, Madam Secretary, Designated Survivor. As someone who was there, I just was interested if you thought any of them have ever gotten it right, or if any of them came close, or what you think is kind of the most accurate portrayal of what an actual day or experience is like.
The West Wing was pretty good. I mean, it was still TV. I mean, they walk faster, they talk faster. Most of them are better looking, people working in the White House. But it was based on real life experiences. And for me, it was, they actually asked me to work on that show when I first left the White House. I said no, but I ended up covering it when it began, because Aaron Sorkin actually did say that a lot of the characters were based on some version of me, or at least parts of me, and which was kind of flattering. They ended up using storylines. Several of my former colleagues did work on the show, and they used at least one storyline that was ripped off straight from my experience. I was sued by a group called Judicial Watch. I get sued a lot, I guess. Crazy lawsuit in the late 1990s saying I was part of a conspiracy with James Carville and Hillary Clinton. I wasn't even speaking to Hillary Clinton at the time because of the Monica Lewinsky stuff, but whatever. It was dismissed several times. And I finally got so upset, even though they kept appealing and the dismissals, I had to do one final deposition. And I was so angry in the deposition that I just turned the tables and basically grilled the person who was grilling me during the deposition. And they used that in an episode of The West Wing.
Incredible. Maybe The Situation Room will be a movie at some point. I don't know.
Maybe. I'm working on it.
We have time for one more question.
You're a teenager.
Hi, George.
Oh.
Sorry. I just want to tell you, first of all, you're a fantastic journalist. But
Thank
I'm
you.
curious, your experience, it's a two-part question. Your experience having been in the White House in the first place, how did that prepare you for what you presently do as a journalist? And when you went in to interview all of these duty officers, et cetera, for your book, how did they welcome you? Did they welcome you because you were previously in the White House, or because you were George Stephanopoulos, the journalist?
I think there's no question that my experience has been more positive than negative in that. It's helped me more. I mean, clearly, you know, I because I worked in a Democratic White House, sometimes I'll take some partisan criticism from Republicans who try to use that against me. But generally, among both Republicans and Democrats, I think people recognize that because I was there, I generally, I think I know the right questions to ask. I think what I'm pretty good at is kind of skipping the opening question, which just allows talking points to just come out, and getting more to the meat of the matter more quickly, which is that's in the accountability interviews I do on television, which is a little bit different from trying to get people to tell their stories, which is what I did for the book. And I think that they knew, and many of the people I interviewed I had worked with, so we were, you know, trading stories. And, you know, good journalists always, people in government will often talk to journalists because to try to learn something from them. I know I did when I was in government. The journalists I would speak with the most were the ones who could give me information and insight as well. And I think it becomes much more of a conversation in that way. So I think it did definitely help. I know you wanted to do questions.
I know. I couldn't leave without that happening.
Since you've spoken to so many people and so many friends, my question, looking the way things are now currently in our country, how divided things are, what do you think has changed with the people, I guess, who are choosing to go into government, where so much of it was about, yes, there is more a sense of power and importance, but in the end, it was always back like, okay, I disagree with somebody on foreign policy, coming as a party, but in deep down inside that they love their country and they care about people. That to me is what I find seems to be a lesson. And I don't know, what is as we come up to 2024, do you see that swinging back?
Right now?
Yeah, you're trying to be.
No, and I've spoken about this on the tour because I feel quite strongly about it, and this is probably a good place to end. Mm-hmm. I think it's impossible to exaggerate how abnormal what we're dealing with right now is. It's impossible. We have never, ever in American history had a president or a presidential candidate who rejected the peaceful transfer of power, who's been impeached and indicted for trying to overturn an election. We've never had a president whose platform running for re-election is lying about the last election. We've never had a president who refuses to say in advance that he's going to accept the results of an election. Throw away everything else. Throw away all the other lawsuits. Throw away, they're all important. I think that you could argue that many of them are disqualifying on their own. Throw away all of the activity, everything we learned from the first administration. The simple fact that we have a president and a party who have embraced the idea of overturning an election is beyond anything we've seen in American history. It is fundamental. The bedrock of our country is the peaceful transfer of power, abiding by the Constitution. That is not what is happening right now. And I believe that, and I try to do this in the work I do, I think we can't allow ourselves to be numbed to that fact or allow it all to sort of be absorbed into just another campaign issue. I think it is absolutely fundamental. And, because of that, I believe that, this election really is the most important one of our lifetimes. What we're facing, because what is on the ballot this election is whether it is okay to reject the peaceful transfer of power. And that's a critical question. Thank you.
George, thank you so much for your time.